Hello, and welcome to Indigenous History Now. Today we're going to wrap up our exploration of phonetics in our last language analysis video. If you haven't watched that, go do so. We explored the concept of phonetics, we introduced our language analysis series, and we looked at the main IPA chart of consonants. In today's video, we're going to wrap up the rest of the consonant sounds, diacritic marks, and vowels. So let's get started. So like I said, the chart we explored last time, the main chart that you're going to see if you just look up IPA, is a chart of what's described as pulmonic egressive consonants. So this is the main method of producing sound across all languages, but it is not the only one. This is the method that I described in last video, where air is moving out of your lungs and through your vocal tract. There are three other ways of producing sound. There are ejectives, clicks, and implosives, and that's what we're going to explore here. So an ejective is you make a complete closure of the oral cavity, or not necessarily complete because it can also be a fricative, but you make some sort of restriction in the oral cavity, and then you increase the pressure in the oral cavity such that when you release the ejective, it comes out very forcefully. This is as opposed to, remember last time when we talked about oral stops, also called plosives. They're called a plosive to distinguish it from some other types of stops, here in the ejectives, the clicks, and the implosives. In that, you're just making a complete stop and then you're releasing. With the ejective, you're building up pressure. So, for example, a difference between the two of them. Oral stop, p, ejective, p. Oral stop, t, ejective, t. Ejectives are exclusively voiceless stops or fricatives. You're not going to see any voiced ejectives. They're very common in Indigenous American languages, very common in languages around the world, actually. Of these three, the non-pulmonic consonants, they are by far the most common. And you can see they're represented by just adding an apostrophe to whatever place of articulation is becoming an ejective. So a couple examples. With the fricatives. And then you can also have ejective affricates as well. Then we move on to clicks. Clicks are every linguist who's from a non-click language, this is their favorite thing to talk about and explore. They just get fascinated with them. So what a click is you're producing a closure at two places of articulation. You produce one with the back of the tongue at the velum, and then one forward of that with any other place of articulation. Then what happens is the tongue in between the two of them drops so that it increases the space and thereby creating a vacuum. And then when the forward place of articulation is released, air gets sucked in really quickly, and produces a click sound. We have these in English. We have two main click sounds in English, two or three, but we don't use them to distinguish meaning. For example, those are all click sounds that we use in different contexts in English. So you can see that the clicks are being represented by a two-part symbol. You have one on the left, which is just some velar consonant, and that is used to represent the voicing, because you can have a voiceless click, a voiced click, or a nasal click. One of the closures of a click is at the velum, and you can still release sound through the nasal cavity. So I can produce, I can continuously release my airstream through my nasal cavity. Now you'll see on this chart, on some other IPA charts, they don't include the uvular clicks. So, but this you can see includes both velar and uvular places of articulation for the voiceless, the voiced, and the nasals. It used to be thought that clicks were just produced at the velum. A couple years ago, we discovered that some click languages use the uvula rather than the velum. As far as we know, there is no click language which uses this velar-uvular distinction to distinguish meaning between their clicks. It's just a slight difference in pronunciation. So it's important to note if we want our pronunciation to be as exact as possible, which is we want to be able to represent a high degree of exactness with the IPA, but it's not an important distinction to need to worry about. So the left symbol is voicing, and then the right symbol is the place of articulation of the click. You can either have bilabial, dental, alveolar, lateral alveolar, and then palatal. I hope I was doing that one right. Then we move on to implosives. With ejectives, we're building up pressure and then forcefully releasing air. With an implosive, we're moving that in the opposite direction. So you make a stop closure, and then your larynx actually drops. And this produces, just like with the click where the tongue is dropping between two places of articulation, this produces a vacuum in your mouth so that when you open the stop closure, air gets sucked in. So whereas ejectives are exclusively voiceless, implosives are almost exclusively voiced. You can have voiceless implosives though. So these sound like buh, duh, guh. And you can see they're represented by just taking the place of implosive articulation, adding a little curl to the top of the IPA symbol. Okay, moving on. So there are some consonants which are produced simultaneously at two separate places of articulation. These are our co-articulated consonants. The most common of these for English speakers is a W, W. You'll notice that if you go back and watch our last video, or if you look at the IPA chart here in Wikipedia that we've been using, W, the W sound, is nowhere to be found on it because it is produced at two places of articulation at the same time. It is both a labial consonant and a velar consonant. So it is a voiced labiovelar approximant, W. And you'll see here we have some fricatives, nasals, implosives, and approximants all co-articulating. And I'm not going to go through them because it describes exactly what they are on this chart. So we'll describe vowels first, and then we'll wrap it all up looking at diacritics because those concern both vowels and consonants. So as we described in last video, vowels can't be defined the same way that consonants can, because they are far less restricted and far more free-flowing. So it's much more, it's not just more difficult, it's impossible to use a very strict place and manner of articulation to define a given vowel sound. So instead what we do is we still use a three-feature breakdown, but it's height, backness, and roundness. Now, just like with consonants, vowels are still produced by your tongue being raised in some way to manipulate the shape of your vocal tract. But they are raised in a different fashion than with consonants, of course. So how we describe this, the height is just that. It is how tall in your mouth your tongue is being raised. High vowels, your tongue is very high. Low vowels, it's very low. Mid vowels, it's somewhere in between. This is also described as close or open, as opposed to high or low, but they're synonymous. Backness is, of course, how far forward or backwards in your mouth your tongue is being raised. And then roundness is your lips, whether or not they are rounded. So you can see that the way we have this chart set up is a rough approximation of the shape of the oral cavity itself. And the vowel sounds are placed in their rough place of articulation of the oral cavity. And just like with the consonants, where they had each consonant sound had a pairing of voiceless and voiced, the vowel sounds have pairings of round and unround. Any vowel can be either round or unround. It's very common cross-linguistically for the more forward your vowel sound is, the less round it gets. And this is what English does. For example, the sound E. That is a high front unrounded vowel. The sound OO. That is a high back rounded vowel. Roundness corresponding with the backness is a general principle, but it can be broken. U is a high front rounded vowel. Is a high back unrounded vowel, etc. Another feature of vowels that is important to note is tenseness or laxness. This is a feature that's very hard to define, but essentially some placing pairings seem to have a periphery difference, where you have one pairing which is more central and one pairing which is more peripheral. The more central one we describe as lax, the more peripheral one we describe as tense. What do I mean by that? For example, the high front unrounded vowel. Is it E or is it I? E, I, E, I. They're both high, they're both front, they're both unrounded. One is just a little more high and more front than the other one. That's the tense one. E, I. And this tense laxness distinction is important to make because many languages, including English, have a meaning distinction between a tense or a lax partner. Team versus Tim. Those are two different words, and the only distinction between those two vowels is the tenseness or the laxness. Not every vowel sound has a tense-lax pairing. Okay, an important feature of vowels is, again, their fluidity, which can result in something called diphthongs. So, what is a diphthong? A diphthong is producing two separate vowel sounds in a single syllable. This is opposed to a monophthong where it's one vowel sound in one syllable. What you do with a diphthong is you start at one vowel place of articulation and you glide to another one seamlessly, again within the same syllable. In IPA, it's represented with the two vowel sounds next to each other with some way of representing that they're in the same syllable. You can either use a tie bar, or there are other ways of representing syllabicity with the IPA, and we'll get to those when we get to diacritics. So for example, I, O, I. Those are all diphthongs. There's a difference between I and I. I, I. O, O. If you can segment them into two separate syllables, it's not a diphthong, it's two monophthongs. English diphthongs a lot of its vowels. Personally, I don't know any other language that diphthongs its vowels more regularly than English does. And this can honestly be a problem when English speakers try to learn a second language. For example, just the word I. I said this, I said that. That's a diphthong. I. Go. I go. That's the O on go is a diphthong. O. Most other languages in the world do not regularly diphthong their vowels to the extent that English does. For example, I saw this TikToker, a Hawaiian language TikToker, intro to Hawaiian. Let's learn to say aloha. Aloha. That's a monophthong, but all the English speakers want to say aloha. That's a diphthong. It's different. So I specifically mentioned the high rate of diphthongization in English because we're all English speakers here. We're trying to learn a separate language. It's something to keep in mind. Your English brain is going to want to take a monophthong and turn it into a diphthong. Don't let it do that. Okay, so that was all of our consonants, all of our vowels. Now let's look at these diacritics. The diacritics are used to represent features of phonetics that are Less common, they're also used to represent features of phonetics that are suprasegmental, which extend beyond a single segment, and we'll get to those. Oftentimes, you'll see IPA transcriptions not using diacritics where they could. It's because they're not trying to do an IPA transcription that is as accurate as it could physically possibly be. It's a spectrum on how tight and exact you want your IPA transcription to be, and that will determine, how much you're using your diacritics or not. But they're important to know because you will see them. So our first one here, the syllabic diacritic marks something as its own syllable. For example, written, written. You are going straight from the oral stop to the nasal stop. You're not actually producing a vowel. This is at least in the American English pronunciation. I don't know if they do it differently in other English pronunciations, but in the American English pronunciation, it goes written. You're not actually producing a vowel. The nasal stop at the end is its own syllable. It is syllabic. Non-syllabic, that's usually used on things that are typically could be their own syllable, but in this instance are not. Then we have the consonant release diacritics, starting with aspiration. We talked about this last time with voice onset time, where you introduce a puff of air after your stop release. T, t. Nasal release, you're actually releasing the stop straight into your nasal cavity. Hidden, hidden. You're not saying hidden. Again, you're not producing a vowel. You're going straight from an alveolar stop to an alveolar nasal. And so that stop is being released into a nasal. A lateral release. Waddle, waddle. That's another one. Your alveolar central stop, you're not saying waddle, waddle. You're not releasing the stop and then pronouncing the lateral approximant. You're releasing the stop into a lateral approximant. Waddle. Then we have a couple other ones here. No audible release is just that. You don't actually release the stop sound. You're relying on the fact that it's a stop at a certain place of articulation to hear what it is, but you're not actually releasing it. Then we get to the phonation diacritics. The little circle there is voiceless. This circle is used most of the time to describe a voiceless sound that is not usually voiceless. So, for example, this Wikipedia IPA chart that we've been exploring, if you look at other IPA charts, there are a lot of sounds that they don't have that the Wikipedia one does. Again, it uses a lot of diacritics to represent those. So those sounds are ones that are not usual, but they are possible. Since they are less usual, they are not given their own symbol. They're represented with diacritics. And the most common of these are a place of articulation that is usually voiced, but it could be voiceless. And that's where you use this little circle thing here. Then we have two that say breathy voice and creaky voice. So your voicing isn't just whether or not your vocal folds are being used, voiced or voiceless. It's also how they're being used. There are two other ways of doing it: creaky voice and breathy voice. Breathy voice is also called whisper voice because it's just that. You're just whispering. That's breathy voice. Creaky voice, in some sectors of American English, we describe this as vocal fry. Certain accents in English use this a lot, but we don't distinguish meaning with it. Sounds like that. These two different styles of voicing, again, some languages use them to distinguish meaning, some others do not. Articulation diacritics. So our first one here is dental, of course, describing that a sound is produced at the dental place of articulation. Lingual labial, we talked about that last time as well. That's your tongue to your upper lip. Then we have apical and laminal. Your tongue is divided into several different zones. You have essentially your front, your back, and your root. Your root is back in your throat, and then the front and the back is describing the top, whether it's forward or backwards. And then the front is divided into two more segments: the tip, which is the very end, and the blade, which is the part of the front of your tongue that is just behind the tip. So if you pay very close attention to how you produce your sounds, the ones that are produced here in the front of your mouth, your alveolars, your dentals, your interdentals, some of them are produced using the very tip of your tongue, and some of them are produced using your blade. Your tip is lowered, and it's that part of the front of your tongue that's just behind it. So apical is when you use your tip. Laminal is when you use your blade. Then we have a couple here. Advanced, retracted, raised, lowered. Those are all describing your tongue's position relative to a certain other place of articulation. So advanced is a little bit forward, retracted is a little bit backwards, raised is a little higher, and lowered is a little lower. Centralized and mid-centralized, these are used to describe vowels. Centralized means you're moving more towards the center. For a back vowel means you're moving forward. For a front vowel means you're moving backwards. You could substitute this by describing a front vowel as being retracted and a back vowel as being advanced, but it's nice to have this centralized diacritic to describe a relationship between the two of them, that they're both moving towards the center. Mid-center is you're not just moving front or back, but you're moving towards the center of the vowel cavity itself. So if you're a lower vowel, you're also moving a little higher, as well as moving either forward or backwards. If you're high vowel, you're moving a little lower, as well as moving either forward or backwards. Then we have co-articulation diacritics. These are, like we've described with co-articulation, diacritics that are produced at the same time. More or less rounding. Your lips are already round. It's just the extent to how much they're getting rounded. Labialized, palatized, velarized, pharyngealized. All of these are two places of articulation are being involved in a situation where usually only one is. Labialized, your lips are rounded while you are producing the sound. For example, in the Lushootseed word for door, shub, whoosh, whoosh. I'm not saying gwash, shub. It's got a labialized voiced velar stop. Shub. My lips are rounded while I am producing the G sound at the same time. Shub. Palatized, your tongue is moving towards your palate while you're producing the sound. Velarized, the back of your tongue is raised up to your velum while you're producing the sound. Pharyngealized, your pharynx is tightening while you're producing the sound. And then this one here, velarized or pharyngealized. In older terminology, I've seen this described as laryngealized. It's kind of either or back there. Either your pharynx is getting tightened or your tongue is being raised up to your velum. Then we have advanced and retracted tongue root. This is another feature in vowels that is used to distinguish meaning in some languages. Like I talked about the anatomy of the tongue, front, back, root, your root being in your throat. Some languages draw a distinction as to whether the tongue root is forward or backwards. If it's forward, it's making a larger space in your pharynx. If it's back, it's making a smaller space in your pharynx. Nasalization, we talked about it last time. Your velum is open in an environment where it's usually not. And then rhoticity, this is also called R coloring. Sometimes vowels are produced with a sound kind of R-ish. For example, hearse, hearse. I'm not actually pronouncing a vowel and then the R. The vowel and the R are merging together. Hearse, hurt, war, water. Sometimes rhoticity is represented as a syllabic R sound, or sometimes it's pronounced as a rhotic. It's represented as a rhotic vowel sound. It could go either way. Okay, then we get to the suprasegmentals. So everything we've been talking about so far are features of sound that affect a single segment. There are some features of phonetics that cross over multiple segments. For example, the stress of a word is a suprasegmental feature, or a language's rhythm or something like that. So stress is, again, it's another thing that's hard to define, but most words have stress. Most content words have stress. Stress is, a syllable is made slightly more prominent than another. For example, Massachusetts versus Massachusetts. The only difference between those two pronunciations is where I am placing my stresses. Most words have at least one stress. Some words have multiple syllables that are stressed. If you have multiple syllables that are stressed within the same word, Usually you will have one dominant stressed syllable, that's your primary stress, and any other stressed syllable is less pronounced, it's less stressed, it is secondary. So you can see how we represent that with the primary versus secondary stress, the little tick at the top or at the bottom, and it's placed at the front of the syllable. A syllable, again, also can be somewhat hard to define. You'll notice all these super segmental features can be pretty hard to define, but a syllable is not synonymous with a vowel, like we've discussed. You can have syllabic consonants as well, and a syllable usually consists of like a vowel root, and then either an onset with consonants that precede that vowel, and a coda with consonants that follow that vowel. Now, languages differ as to how many consonants they allow to be within a single syllable. How many consonants can be in the onset, how many consonants can be in the coda, differs from language to language. Some languages, lots of them in the Salish language family, you can have entire syllables of 5 consonants and no vowel. But anyway, like I said, languages differ in where they draw their syllable lines. So where you place the stress is going to be different language to language, but it's at the beginning of your syllable, it's not the beginning of the vowel. Long vowels, many languages make a long-short distinction. In Hawaiian, kala versus kala. Those are 2 separate words. So we have long, we have half long, and then extra short. I realized while I was editing that I forgot to talk about long consonants. You can have long vowels, you can also have long consonants. Long consonants are also known as geminates. And they're basically just as they sound. You just hold on to the consonant sound. So for example, Melissa versus Melissa. And you can also have long stop consonants. And what you do there is you basically hold on to the stop closure. For example, Peter versus Peter. Fickle versus fickle. And languages do use the long-short distinction in consonants to distinguish meaning, including in stops. Now, there are 2 ways you can represent geminates in the IPA. You can either use one segment with the long diacritic after it, as shown on the top example, or you can double the segment and have the no audible release diacritic atop the first one, as in the bottom example. And then your syllable breaks are represented with a little period there. Now, phonetic boundaries and syntactic and morphological boundaries are not always exactly the same. So many times languages will, across word boundaries, have a single syllable. Spanish does this, Hawaiian does this. English and German tend to halt their syllables at their word boundaries, but not every language does that. So we use this linking symbol to describe that this may be a word boundary, but it's not a phonetic boundary. It's not a syllable boundary. While I was editing, I decided to insert an example to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So let's take the English phrase bad omen. So like I've described, languages differ in how they compose their syllables, where they draw their syllable boundaries, what they consider acceptable for a syllable to be made up of, what they will break apart into separate syllables, and all of those are determined by a language's rules of syllabicity, how it chooses to divide the syllable boundaries across a word or a sentence. So in English, one of the syllabicity rules is that a word boundary is a syllable boundary. So we have here 3 syllables. Bad is 1 syllable, o another, men another. English also has a very strong preference for having an onset in its syllables. In other words, having a consonant to precede a vowel. If it has an option between tacking an onset onto a syllable or syllabifying a syllable with a bare vowel with no consonant onset, it will choose to add the onset. So let's change our syllabicity rules and say that word boundaries are not phonetic boundaries, so we can syllabify across word boundaries, then what we're going to wind up with is not bad omen, but rather bad omen. The D at the end of bad becomes a perfectly acceptable onset for the O at the beginning of omen, because we are now no longer considering a word boundary to be a syllable boundary. Like I said, there are plenty of languages that do this, Spanish and Hawaiian and many others, and plenty that do not. Intonation, I'm not going to describe these symbols because you're not going to really see them very often. I've only ever seen these symbols under intonation here in my phonetics class. But intonation is the pitch of a word. Now, there's a difference between tone and intonation. Tone is a pitch across a single segment or a single word. Intonation is a pitch across a whole sentence. And intonation patterns can be used to distinguish meaning. In English, we tend to use a rising intonation for our questions. Did I really say that? Across the sentence, my pitch is rising. No, I didn't say that. Is either a flat intonation or even a falling intonation. And of course, languages differ in their intonation patterns across sentences. Okay, so having discussed intonation, let's now go to tone, also known as pitch. And like I said, pitch is a feature of a single word or a single segment. Some languages use pitch, but they only have one special pitch per word. Those are usually called pitch accent languages. Some people define those as a subsegment of tonal languages because you're using a pitch in a single word. Some other tonal languages can have multiple pitches within a single word. So we have two separate ways of representing pitch. We can either use these little diacritic marks over the symbol, or we use this 2 or 3 symbol representation, but they mean the same thing. Some pitches are flat and some are dynamic. So you can have a pitch which rises or falls, or rises and falls over a single segment, or you can have just a single pitch for a single segment. For example, mid-rising, where you start in a middle pitch and you rise, low rising, you start at a low pitch and you rise, high falling, you start at a high pitch and you fall, mid falling, you start at a middle pitch and you fall, etc. And just as with anything, languages which use pitch or tone differ in their inventory. So, for example, a lot of tonal languages use only 2 or 3 different tones. Mandarin famously has 5. It differs language to language. Okay, that is almost it. We're just about done. Just a few more things to wrap it up. You may come across the words obstruent versus sonorant. An obstruent is, those are stops, fricatives, or affricates. They are sounds which are produced with an obstruction of the vocal tract. Sonorants are sounds which are produced with no obstruction of the vocal tract. So there's a difference between restricting and completely obstructing the vocal tract. All vowels are sonorants, but not all consonants are sonorants, but all obstruents are consonants. Some other words you might see are coronal and dorsal. This refers to tongue anatomy again. Like I said, we have laminal, we have apical, which are 2 parts of the front of your tongue. Coronal and dorsal refers to whether you are using the front or the back of your tongue. So a laminal or an apical sound, both of those are going to be coronal because they are both using the front of your tongue. Okay, that about wraps it up for phonetics. Next time we will come back with phonology, which is describing the intersection between sound and meaning. If you like this video and you want to learn more and you want to stay in the loop, please do like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.